The sky that morning was the color of a bruise that hadn't finished forming, purple at the edges, yellow at the center. And altogether the kind of sky that made experienced ranch hands look twice at their boots and say nothing. Nora Calloway was elbow-deep in a cast-iron pot of rendered lard when she heard the wagon wheels groan against the frozen ruts of the North Road. She did not look up immediately. She had learned long ago that a woman who jerks her head at every sound does not last long in this country. Instead, she listened. Counted the hoofbeats. Counted the silence between them. 2 horses. 1 wagon. 1 man driving and at least 2 more bodies by the way the axle complained. She wiped her hands on the flour sack tied at her waist and walked to the door of the bunkhouse kitchen. She ran for Hal Deering's Double Spur Ranch. The wind off the Laramie Plain hit her full in the face, sharp as a slap, cold enough to make her eyes water without asking permission. The light was hammered brass at best, the sun hanging low and indifferent as a judge who has already made up his mind. The wagon stopped near the main house. The man who climbed down moved like a person who had not slept in several days, careful, deliberate, every motion measured as though he was not certain his legs would honor him. He reached back into the wagon bed and lifted down a small girl, maybe 6 years old, wrapped in a horse blanket. Behind the girl came a boy, older, perhaps 10, who jumped down himself and immediately stood straight, chin up, in the way that boys do when they are trying very hard not to be afraid. Nora watched. She saw the man press his hand once to the top of the girl's head, a gesture so brief and so private that it almost did not exist. Then he turned and caught Nora watching him from 30 yards off, and he did not look away the way guilty men do. He just looked at her. Steadily. The way a man looks who has run out of options and knows it and is not yet sure whether to feel ashamed. Her name, later, meant nothing to the town. She was the cook. She was the woman who kept the bunkhouse warm and the men fed. She was the one who mended what needed mending and said little and asked for nothing beyond what was agreed upon at the start of the season. They thought she was just a cook. They were about to find out what she actually was. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The man's name was Elias Holt, and he had come from Cheyenne by way of bad luck and worse roads. Hal Deering met him at the porch steps and the 2 men shook hands in the formal, careful way of men who respect each other without warmth, the kind of handshake that meant business and nothing more. Nora caught pieces of it from across the yard as she carried a bucket of ash from the kitchen door. Hal's brother's son. That much she gathered. The wife had died, consumption or fever, she couldn't make out which, and Elias had sold what he had in Cheyenne and driven 4 days north with his children and $11 left to his name. Arriving at the Double Spur with no more ceremony than a stray dog coming in from a storm. Hal Deering was not a cruel man, but he was not a particularly warm one either. He was the sort of man who kept his ranch running with the same emotional investment he gave his fence posts. He maintained what was necessary and let the rest go. He showed Elias the empty room at the back of the main house, the room that had served as storage since his own wife had left, not to death but to her sister's place in Denver. Which in this country amounted to the same thing. He told Elias he could work for his keep. He told the children nothing at all, which was itself a kind of statement. Then Hal looked at Nora across the yard with the expression he always used when he wanted something done but did not care to ask directly. She understood. She turned back to the kitchen. The state of the main house was something that required a person to stand in the doorway for a moment and simply absorb it. Hal's wife, Mabel, had been gone 14 months, and Hal had made no particular effort at upkeep beyond what directly inconvenienced him. There were dishes on the table that had not been dishes recently but had aspired to return to that state someday. There was a broken window latch on the east wall that had been letting a thread of December air in for so long that the wallpaper beside it had gone soft and begun to curl. There were layers of grease on the stovetop that suggested history rather than cooking. Boot mud tracked from the door to every room in concentric rings of carelessness. The children stood in the center of this and said nothing. Nora stood in the doorway, assessed it, and began to work. She did not make a show of it. She did not sigh loudly or announce her intentions. She simply took off her coat, hung it on the nail by the door, and moved to the stove. She pulled the ash drawer and cleaned it into the bucket she'd brought. She laid fresh kindling, cedar, because it caught fast and smelled clean, and then split oak on top, the good dense kind that would hold the heat through evening. She struck the match herself, sheltered the flame with her body against the draft from that broken east window, and waited until the fire was truly alive before she stood up. The girl, whose name was Cora, had sat down on the floor beside the wood box without being invited. She was watching Nora with the enormous, still eyes of a child who has recently been taught that the world is unreliable. Nora did not speak to her immediately. She went to her kitchen, or the bunkhouse kitchen, her territory, and returned with what she had, a half-cured ham that had 2 good meals left in it. A sack of dried beans that had been soaking since yesterday in a clay crock, a basket of winter root vegetables, 2 onions, a jar of rendered bacon fat, a can of molasses, and a cloth bag of cornmeal that was almost but not quite gone. She set the ham to boil in the deep pot. She diced the onions without a word, her eyes going quietly wet the way they always did, a reaction she had long since decided was the onions' fault and no one else's. She fried them in bacon fat until they went golden soft and the kitchen filled with the smell of something patient and warm. The boy, whose name she learned later was Thomas, had not sat down. He stood near the door with his father's posture and his father's careful eyes, watching Nora work with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone tallying costs, figuring whether this kindness had a price attached. She sliced cornbread from a loaf she'd made that morning, put it on the back of the stove to warm, and added beans and molasses and salt pork to the pot with the ham. She added dried sage, she kept it bundled from last summer, hanging in her kitchen, and a bay leaf. And she set the whole thing to simmer low and slow the way her mother had done in a different time and a different place when the world had been, briefly, a manageable thing. By the time Elias came inside from seeing to the horses, the kitchen was warm. Actually warm, not the thin, apologetic warmth of a fire barely alive, but the deep, settled warmth that lives in a room when food has been cooking for long enough to mean it. He stopped in the doorway the same way Nora had earlier, absorbing it. Only he wasn't assessing work to be done. He was absorbing something he had not encountered in months and did not quite have a name for. He sat at the table without being asked. The children came to the table. Nora set the pot in the center, the cornbread alongside it, and a pitcher of water drawn from the pump before it had frozen solid. She set 4 places, then started to set a 5th and stopped herself, turned back to her kettle. "There's enough," Elias said. His voice was quiet and roughened at the edges, like a board that's been out in too many seasons. "I've eaten," she said. It wasn't entirely true. She pulled a stool to the corner of the kitchen and ate standing up from a bowl she did not fill quite to the top. And she watched the 3 of them eat the way she had watched a great many things in this life, quietly, with her full attention, without letting on that she was watching at all. The girl, Cora, ate everything in her bowl and then looked up at Nora with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite wonder, but something in between that didn't have a word for it in any language Nora knew. Then she put her head down on her folded arms on the table and fell asleep between one breath and the next, the way only a child or an animal who has been running on pure survival for too long finally can. Thomas cleaned his bowl without comment, stood up, and carried it to the wash basin. Nora noted this. Elias sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes somewhere past the window, in the direction of whatever he'd left behind or lost or buried. He stayed that way for a long time. Nora washed the dishes. The fire in the stove clicked and settled. Outside, the first thin breath of a real winter began to come down from the north, just testing itself against the land, the way a storm will do before it decides to be serious about things. The days after that first evening moved the way December days in Wyoming do, short and blunt. The light appearing around 7 in the morning with no particular enthusiasm and giving up entirely by 4 in the afternoon, leaving behind a cold so thorough it had texture to it, like river clay pressed against the skin. Nora kept to her work and let the children come to her in their own time. It was Cora who came first, as she'd expected. Small children are still close enough to their instincts to know where warmth lives and to move toward it without pride getting in the way. She appeared at the kitchen door the second morning while Nora was making biscuits, and she did not ask to come in. Just stood there with her braids half undone from sleep and her stockinged feet and a look of careful hope on her face. Nora slid the flour sack across the work table. Cora climbed onto the stool without another word and began to pour flour with the gravity of a child given real work, which is the most serious kind of gravity there is. They worked together for the better part of an hour, Nora shaping and Cora pressing the scraps into small shapes, animals, mostly, and one thing that might have been a horse or a man. It was hard to say. Nora baked them all. She put the small shapes on a separate pan and did not mention them at breakfast, but she made sure they were on Cora's plate. Thomas took longer. He spent the first 3 days doing what Elias asked of him, hauling wood, breaking ice on the stock tank, mending what fence posts could be mended before the ground froze too hard for digging, and he did it all with the expression of a person performing a contract, not a life. But on the 4th day, when Nora went to the smokehouse for the second ham and found the door latch had iced over solid, she was working at it with the heel of her hand when Thomas appeared beside her with a piece of wire he'd bent into a pick, and without a word, worked the latch free. She looked at him. He looked at the door. "My mother used to freeze that same way," he said, meaning the latch, but meaning other things too. "Most things do, once," Nora said. "Doesn't mean they stay that way." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and they reached a kind of understanding that did not require any further language. After that, he started appearing in the kitchen the way Cora did, not asking for anything, just being present, which was its own kind of asking. Elias remained careful. He worked hard, Hal could not find fault with that, and he spoke when spoken to and thanked Nora for the meals with a sincerity that was almost painful to witness. The way a man thanks you when he is unused to being given anything and cannot quite believe it doesn't cost something. He repaired the broken east window latch without being asked, which Nora noticed without comment. She noticed the way he noticed what needed fixing and then fixed it, quietly, without expecting acknowledgement. She began to leave coffee on the stove for him at night. He began to leave the firewood box full when he came back from the evening chores. They were careful not to make anything of it. 40 miles south, in the river town of Casper Bend, a man named Del Pittman was drinking rye whiskey at the bar of a saloon called the Meridian and asking questions that were not quite questions. Del Pittman was Mabel Deering's brother, and he had opinions about the double spur that the law had not yet agreed to enforce but that he intended to make persuasive by other means. He was a man of medium height and extraordinary patience in the specific way that dangerous men are patient, not because they have found peace but because they have decided that the right moment has not yet arrived. He had heard about Elias Holt through a freighter who'd passed through Cheyenne. He had heard about the children. He had heard about Hal's reduced circumstances since Mabel had departed, about the mortgaged pasture, the low cattle prices last fall. The fact that Hal had let 3 of his best hands go before winter. And Del Pittman, who had decided years ago that the double spur should belong to the Pittman family by virtue of his sister's marriage and his own unwillingness to let things go, had begun to form a picture in his mind. He set down his whiskey glass with the deliberate care of a man who is not drunk but is choosing to appear so. And he said to the man beside him, the dull-eyed fellow named Asa who did what he was paid to do and asked no questions, he said, "I think it's time we took a ride up north." Asa said nothing. Which was what he was paid for. Del Pittman smiled at the bottom of his empty glass. Outside, the same north wind that was testing itself against the double spur rattled the shutters of the Meridian. It had made its decision now. It was going to be serious about things. The town of Harlan Creek sat 8 miles east of the double spur on a road that was, in good weather, merely inconvenient and, in bad weather, a moral test. It had a general store, a post office that shared space with a barber shop, a livery, a church whose congregation held opinions with the same grip they used for their firearms, and a woman named Ida Marsh who was not the mayor but who exercised more practical authority over the town's social arrangements than any elected man. Nora had driven the wagon into Harlan Creek every 2 weeks for 4 years, and in that time she and Ida Marsh had achieved a mutual understanding based on the fact that Nora bought her supplies, paid cash, said little, and did not require Ida's approval for anything. It was not a friendship. It was a successful treaty. That changed the first week of December, when Nora arrived in the wagon with Cora beside her and Thomas in the bed, and Elias Holt riding alongside on the roan mare that was the only horse he'd brought from Cheyenne. The general store was warm the way public places are warm, bodies and a stove and an underlying current of other people's business being turned over like cold earth. There were 3 women in the fabric section and 2 men at the counter, and every single one of them turned when the door opened. The way people turn in small towns when they sense something worth discussing has arrived. Nora set her list on the counter and began to fill her order. She had done this 10,000 times and she did it now the same way, methodically, without hurry, checking items against what she'd written. Ida Marsh materialized from behind the dry goods shelves the way she always did, as though she had been present all along and simply chosen this moment to be visible. "Miss Calloway," she said, in the tone that meant she had something to say and was determining the most effective angle of approach. "Mrs. Marsh," Nora said, and continued checking her list. "I see you've brought company." "I brought a list." The company drove itself. There was a pause in which Ida Marsh recalibrated. She was a sharp woman and she recognized a door that had been closed. She opened another one. "I understand Hal Deering's taken in his nephew," she said, pitching her voice at the conversational level that was designed to carry. "Along with the children. From Cheyenne." The way she said Cheyenne suggested it was a city famous primarily for producing problems. "I understand that too," Nora said. "And that they're all living at the Double Spur." A pause. "Together." Nora put down a sack of cornmeal and looked at Ida Marsh directly. She had grey eyes, Nora did, and she used them rarely enough that when she did turn them on a person with their full attention, it tended to produce a physical response. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "I cook for the Double Spur. I have cooked for the Double Spur for 4 years. I live in the bunkhouse kitchen, which has its own door and its own lock and which I use both features of regularly. Mr. Holt's family occupies the main house with Mr. Deering. I don't know what arrangement you imagine exists, but I suspect it's a more interesting one than the truth. So I'll leave you to enjoy it." One of the women in the fabric section made a sound that could have been a cough or a laugh. Ida Marsh's expression performed a complex series of adjustments. But she was not finished. She was, in fact, just beginning. "It isn't about what I imagine," Ida said, lowering her voice slightly now, which was more dangerous than the public tone. "It's about what the children see. 2 women in a situation like this, with a widower, it sends a message, Miss Calloway, to impressionable young minds about how the world is arranged. The message those children have most recently received," Nora said quietly, "is that their mother died and their father had nowhere to go. I imagine that particular lesson outweighs any concern you have about domestic arrangement." She picked up the cornmeal again. "Now, I need 2 pounds of dried apples and a tin of baking powder if you've restocked." Later, in the street, Elias found her loading the wagon bed. He had been at the post office and returned with the particular blankness of expression that means a man has overheard something he was not meant to hear and is deciding what to do with it. "She give you trouble?" he asked. "She gave me conversation," Nora said. "I gave her something to think about." "They're talking." "They were always talking. The subject changed, that's all." She handed him a crate to lift into the wagon. He took it. "I don't want you to have trouble on account of us," he said. She looked at him, and for a moment the wind off the street moved between them like a third person trying to leave. "Trouble," she said finally, "has never once asked my permission. It doesn't start now." She climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Get the children." He stood in the street another moment. Then he did. Thomas had found Cora at the edge of the mercantile porch, looking at the window display with the solemn attention of a person regarding something beautiful that does not belong to them. There was a paper twist of lemon drops in a jar in the window. Elias went in and came out again quickly and put the paper twist in his coat pocket without making a production of it. And when Cora climbed into the wagon bed and complained that her throat was sore from the cold, he passed them back to her without comment. Thomas saw this and said nothing. But his chin wasn't up quite so high on the ride home, and his eyes had gone softer around the edges, and Nora, driving, noticed all of it the way she noticed everything, completely and without appearing to. Del Pittman and Asa rode in from the south just after midnight on a Thursday, when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that had no interest in negotiating. The sky had gone iron grey all afternoon, and by evening the first serious snow had begun, not a blizzard yet, but the full, deliberate beginning of one. The kind of snow that falls without urgency because it knows it has all the time it needs. Nora was awake. She was almost always awake at this hour. It was a habit she had acquired long ago, in circumstances she did not discuss, and it had become less a habit than a feature of her character, like her grey eyes or her steady hands. She sat in the kitchen in the dark, the stove banked low, a cup of something that had been coffee earlier holding warmth in her hands, and she listened to the snow. She heard the horses when they were still a quarter-mile out. Not because she was extraordinary. Because she had learned to listen to what the ranch sounds like when nothing is wrong, and these sounds were wrong. 2 horses, moving slow and careful, which is not how men come calling on legitimate business in the middle of the night. Men with legitimate business ride at a reasonable pace because they have nothing to hide about their arrival time. She set down the cup. She moved to the corner of the kitchen where she kept the Winchester, a model 1873 she'd owned for 9 years, which she had cleaned every other Sunday the way other women went to church. With the same regularity and considerably more practical faith. She checked the load without lighting a lamp, her fingers knowing the action the way they knew biscuit dough or the cast iron handle, by feel, by long familiarity. By a knowledge that lived in the hand rather than the mind. She did not go to the main house to wake Elias. She went out the kitchen's back door, into the cold and the snow, moving along the wall of the bunkhouse to the corner where she could see the yard. 2 men, dismounted. One was slight and moved quickly, toward the barn. The other was taller, moving toward the main house. And his posture had the particular deliberate quality of a man who has decided something and is going through the motions of arriving at that decision. Del Pittman. She had never seen him, but she knew enough from the shape of him and the direction of his walk, toward Hal Deering's main house at midnight in a snowstorm, to understand what she was looking at. She understood Ida Marsh's concern differently now. Not idle gossip. Information being gathered for a purpose. She let the slight man, Asa, get into the barn. Then she put 2 fingers to her lips and whistled, a short, low note, the signal she used for the ranch dogs, which brought 2 of them at a fast, quiet trot out of the darkness. She pointed toward the barn with 2 fingers. The dogs understood this, because she had trained them herself. She walked out into the yard toward Del Pittman, and she did it without hurry, because she was in her yard and it was midnight and she was carrying a Winchester. And she did not owe anyone the appearance of fear. "That's far enough," she said. He stopped. His hand went, just barely, just the beginning of a gesture, toward his coat. "Don't," she said. "I have been awake since before you crossed the south fence and I am cold and not in good humor and this rifle is already level. Think carefully." He thought carefully. His hand stopped. "I'm looking for Hal Deering," he said. His voice was smooth in the way of men who have practiced persuasion until it became reflexive. "Hal Deering is asleep," she said. "Come back at a reasonable hour and I will see if he's available. I have business, you have business you chose to conduct in a blizzard at midnight. That kind of business doesn't generally improve with company." She held the rifle without effort, without the shaking that cold hands might suggest. "Your man in the barn has found the dogs by now. I'd encourage you to call him out before they make an irreversible decision." A silence. From the barn came the sound of something between a shout and a yelp, and then Asa emerged at a rapid pace with both hands raised and 2 large dogs circling him with professional attention. Del Pittman looked at Asa. He looked at Nora. He looked at the rifle. "You know who I am," he said. "I know what you are," she said. "That's sufficient." The door of the main house opened then, and Elias Holt came out in his coat and his boots with his own revolver in his hand, and behind him Hal Deering, with a lamp and an expression of a man who has not slept and has arrived in the middle of something he needs a moment to interpret. "Dell," Hal said, from the porch. The single word had the flat quality of a man identifying a problem, not greeting a person. Del Pittman looked at all three of them and made his calculation and put a smooth, cold smile on his face that meant the visit was over, but the intention was not. "Just calling on family," he said. "Family comes in daylight," Elias said. Pittman backed toward his horse with the unhurried deliberation of a man demonstrating that he is choosing to leave, not being made to. He mounted. He looked at Nora last, and in the dark and the falling snow his eyes were very still, which was the most dangerous kind of eyes. He said, tipping his hat. She watched him until he was past the gate. Then she went back inside and put the rifle where it lived and put more wood on the stove and sat down and drank the rest of the cold coffee, and her hands did not shake. Because this was not the first time she had stood between something she decided to protect and something that wanted to take it. And she had learned a long time ago that shaking was a luxury she could not afford. Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway in his coat, the snow still on his shoulders. "You all right?" he asked. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make fresh coffee." He Saturday. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and the stove ticked and settled, and outside the blizzard that had been politely announcing itself all evening finally arrived in full. The wind coming down from the north with the sound of something that has made up its mind. "He'll come back," Elias said. "He will," she agreed. "With a lawyer this time, most likely." He turned his cup in his hands. "Hal owes him. On the pasture mortgage. I didn't know it when I came, but I know it now." Nora nodded. She had known it for 3 weeks. She had been thinking about it steadily, the way she thought about most problems, at night, quietly, from every angle, until a solution presented itself. "Then we deal with a lawyer," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table, and the lamplight was low and the snow was coming hard against the window. And there was the particular quality to the room that exists when two people have stood together through something dangerous and found each other still standing on the same side. "Why?" he asked. Not as challenge. As genuine inquiry. "This isn't your trouble." She thought about that for a moment. "The children ate in this kitchen," she said. "That makes it my kitchen's trouble. And my kitchen's trouble is mine." He looked at her a long time. Then he nodded, once, with the gravity of a man accepting a contract he intends to honor. "All right," he said. Outside, the blizzard laid itself down over the double spur and everything around it, white and absolute and indifferent, and inside the kitchen the stove held its heat, and they drank their coffee. And no one came again that night. The blizzard lasted 4 days. In those 4 days, no one arrived from outside and no one left. And the double spur became a world that contained only itself, the main house and the bunkhouse kitchen and the barn and the endless work of keeping all three functional against a storm that had decided to be thorough about things. The snow came sideways and then came straight down and then came sideways again. And the drifts built up against the east wall of the barn until they reached the hayloft door and had to be shoveled back twice daily to keep the door from being sealed entirely. They worked together, all of them, and the work made things simple the way work often does. Thomas and Nora dug out the stock tank before dawn each morning, breaking ice with a pick in the dark and the snow, passing the pick between them without speaking. Cora brought hot water from the kitchen in a covered pot. She had appointed herself this task on the second day and performed it with great ceremony. Elias and Hal handled the cattle, moving the most vulnerable animals into the barn's lower section, hauling feed through thigh-high drifts. Losing sleep to check on the calves that had been foolish enough to be born in November. During those 4 days, Nora made bread every morning and soup every afternoon and kept the kitchen warm enough that it was the warmest room on the property by a significant margin. And people came to it the way people come to light, instinctively, gratefully, without making too much of it. Hal Deering came and sat at the kitchen table for the first time since his wife had left and ate 2 bowls of soup without comment, which Nora counted as the most significant development of the entire winter. On the evening of the 3rd day, when the worst of the storm had made a temporary agreement with itself to rest, Nora sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen and wrote a letter to a lawyer in Cheyenne whose name she had been given 4 years ago by a woman who had needed exactly the kind of help she was now seeking. She wrote carefully, in the plain and specific language she used for problems that required solutions rather than sympathy. She described the mortgage. She described Del Pittman. She described the arrangement at the double spur. She asked a specific question, whether there was a legal instrument by which the property could be secured against the kind of claim Pittman was preparing to make. She knew the answer before she asked it. She asked it because knowing it herself was not sufficient. It needed to be on paper, from a lawyer, and it needed to be witnessed. On the 4th day, the storm released its grip and the sun came out with the peculiar, aggressive brightness that follows a blizzard, everything white and flat and merciless with reflected light. Nora hitched the wagon and drove to Harlan Creek through roads that barely deserved the name, arrived at the post office, sent the letter by return post, and then walked to Ida Marsh's general store. Ida Marsh looked up from the counter with the expression of a woman bracing for a conversation she has been both dreading and anticipating. "Mrs. Marsh," Nora said, "I'd like to speak with you privately, if you're willing." Ida Marsh's expression shifted through several stages and settled on something that might have been respect or might have been curiosity. She led Nora to the back room, which smelled of cedar and old paper and the particular mustiness of a room that holds important things. Nora told her about Del Pittman. She told her about the midnight visit. She told her about the mortgage and what Pittman intended to do with it. She told it plainly, without drama, the way she told most things. Ida Marsh listened without interruption, which was itself a remarkable event. Then Nora said, "I know you have concerns about the arrangement at the double spur. I'm telling you what the alternative is. Del Pittman gets that property, Hal Deering is out. Elias Holt and those children are out. And you'll have a man running the largest ranch in the county who came calling with a hired hand in the middle of a blizzard to intimidate a woman and 2 children. Silence. What do you want from me?" Ida Marsh asked, and for the first time there was nothing strategic in her voice. She was asking a real question. "The town knows what you think," Nora said. "It adjusts itself accordingly. I'd like the town to know that Elias Holt is a man of good character and that his children are well cared for and that the double spur is a stable, legitimate operation that does not require outside interference." She paused. "I'd like the town to know that before Pittman's lawyer arrives." Ida Marsh looked at her hands for a long moment. "Are you and the Holt man intending to marry?" she asked. Not with judgment now, but with the practical consideration of a woman who understands how the world arranges itself. Nora had thought about this question for the better part of 4 days. That, she said carefully, is a decision between consenting adults who have a great deal of respect for each other. But I will tell you this, if a marriage would secure those children's situation and shut the door on Del Pittman's legal maneuvering, then it is a solution that neither of us would be foolish enough to dismiss. She held Ida Marsh's gaze. It would also, she added quietly, be honest. Ida Marsh was silent for a very long moment. Then she said, "Mole Cutler at the bank has been unhappy with the Pittman family since the trouble over the survey line last spring. The Hendersons won't vote in favor of anything that benefits a man who ran their cattle off the South Road. And Reverend Adler," she paused, "has said privately that a family new to the area deserves the benefit of Christian doubt before Christian judgment." She straightened a bolt of cloth on the shelf beside her, aligning it with the precision of a woman who has made a decision and is performing an action while her mind settles into it. "I'll see that the right people know the right things." Nora nodded. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it entirely. The response from the Cheyenne lawyer came 9 days later, delivered by a rider who was being paid extra for winter roads and said so twice before he'd let go of the letter. What the letter contained was a document, carefully worded, precisely constructed, that outlined the legal process by which a property mortgage, held by a third party with no direct claim to the estate itself, could be challenged under Wyoming territorial property law if the primary landholder established clear continuity of operation and domestic settlement. In shorter terms, if Hal Deering could demonstrate that the double spur was a functioning, settled, family-occupied property rather than a defaulting one-man operation, the grounds for Pittman's claim became substantially narrower. Hal read the letter twice. Then he sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he looked at Elias. "Stay on," he said. "Not as charity. As partner. Quarter share, built to half over 5 years." He cleared his throat. "The place needs people in it. That's a fact." Elias looked at the letter, then at his uncle, then across the kitchen at Nora, who was at the stove doing exactly what she always did. "You'd want it legal," Elias said. "On paper." On paper, Hal agreed. What happened next in the kitchen, in the days that followed, in the conversations that happened in the early mornings when the coffee was on and the children were still asleep, was private enough that it does not belong entirely to this story. What does belong to it is this: on a cold afternoon in late January, with the snow still deep on the ground but the light coming back at last, longer each day, arriving a few minutes earlier than the day before, the way good things return, Nora Calloway and Elias Holt rode together to the Harlan Creek Courthouse and signed their names to 2 documents. One was a property partnership agreement. The other was a marriage license. They said little about either on the ride home. The road was better than it had been and the horses moved well and the sky was the particular pale blue of winter ending its argument with the land. Somewhere past the ridge they could see the double spur's smoke rising from the chimney. Thomas had kept the fire, and the sight of it had the specific quality that smoke from your own chimney has when you have been away and the cold is bad and you are almost home. When Del Pittman's lawyer arrived 3 weeks later with papers and the composed expression of a man expecting an easy victory, he was met at the gate by Hal Deering and Elias Holt and presented in return with a considerable weight of paper of their own: the partnership agreement, the marriage license, the lawyer's letter, and a letter from 6 prominent Harlan Creek citizens including Ida Marsh and Mole Cutler and Reverend Adler, attesting to the character and stability of the double spur operation and its residents. Del Pittman's lawyer read through it with the carefully neutral expression of a man recalculating. He rode back to Casper Bend that afternoon and the law did not come again. Del Pittman came once more himself, the following spring, and what passed between him and Hal Deering on the front porch with the door closed was not overheard by anyone and was never reported. What was reported, by the stable boy who saw him leave, was that he rode out at a pace that suggested he had not gotten what he had come for and had been made to understand, clearly, that he would not be getting it. After that, the double spur was simply itself, a working ranch with enough people to run it and enough warmth in the main house kitchen to make the winters survivable and enough good years ahead to balance the bad ones behind. There is a specific kind of repair that does not restore something to what it was before, but builds it into something it could not have been without the breaking. The kind where the crack becomes the place where the strongest growth takes root, the way a tree will sometimes split in a storm and grow 2 trunks from the wound, both of them straighter and harder than the original. Nora Calloway had been called many things in her life, and the kindest of them was just a cook. She had allowed this. She had found, over years of living close to the ground and far from anyone's expectations, that being underestimated is a kind of shelter, useful, if you know how to inhabit it. She had cooked 10,000 meals in other people's kitchens before this one. She had kept 10,000 fires burning. She had looked out through 10,000 windows at the kind of country that does not ask you to be anything in particular and will not remember you fondly for what you tried to be. But this kitchen was different. This kitchen had Cora's small handprints in the flour on the work table and Thomas's careful way of stacking the firewood and Elias's coffee cup always on the same nail above the stove, placed there with the unconscious certainty of a man who has decided where he lives. Outside, the land does not care about any of this. The plains stretch north to where the sky falls down to meet them, and the wind comes when it comes, and the winter is what it is. The country is neither kind nor cruel. It simply is, and it requires of you that you decide what you are in response to it. Nora had decided a long time ago. She was not just a cook. She was the warmth that stayed when everything else turned cold. She was the person who kept the fire lit when the blizzard decided to be serious about things. In the end, that was enough. In the end, it was everything.